Hi, Hussein. Very nice to have you on my channel. I've heard lots of good things about you, and I've seen your videos. I'm just really glad you made it today.
Thank you, Angelo. I'm happy to be with you.
Excellent. Could
I
you
also have been watching your work.
Thank you. Could you give us a short an introduction about yourself, what you do what is your position, the Belt and Road Initiative and the LaRouche movement?
Yes, my name is Hussein Askary. I am from Iraq. My family comes from southern Iraq, a city called Nasiriyah, but I was born in Baghdad in 1968. And then our family moved to the northern region of Iraq, to the Kurdish region, where I was raised. So I'm from all parts of Iraq. I am bilingual, speak Arabic, Kurdish. And then I studied in university translation and interpretation, English language. So I learned relatively good English, which helped me later in my life. In 1991, after the Gulf War, we call it the Kuwait War, after Iraq invaded Kuwait, and then the United States mobilized the whole international community to attack Iraq and drive Iraq out to Kuwait. But then what happened is that Iraq itself was destroyed. There was a massive uprising against the government in Iraq. And since we were in the Kurdish region, which rebelled against the central government, and then the Iraqi army counterattacked, so my family and I had to leave our city, Sulaymaniyah, in northern Iraq, towards the borders with Iran. So we had to walk for 6 days and nights with hundreds of thousands of other people, and we ended up in Iran. A year later, I worked with the same year, I worked with the International Red Cross and refugee camps, with the Doctors Without Borders, and I met some journalists and others. And eventually I managed to get to Norway, to get asylum in Norway. And there I continued with my translation interest, and I learned Norwegian. I worked as an interpreter in Norwegian. But in 1994, during the time of the Oslo peace process between Israel and the Palestinians, a group called the International Schiller Institute came to Oslo, where I was still studying at the university, language courses. And then they came up with a very interesting discussion. They said, you have to start with economic development, not political agreements. Because if you don't start to give the people of Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, all these countries, an idea about what can peace achieve for them, their children and grandchildren, starting with building massive infrastructure. That's what the United States and Europe should focus on. Build infrastructure, build agriculture, solve the water problem, and then you can proceed from there to the peace process, which all these other differences become, meaningless by time if you give people an idea that this is good for their living. And I thought that was fascinating, because the way we have learned is that first you change the government, and then everything will be fine. First you have a peace agreement on a piece of paper, and then everything will be fine. And at the Schiller Institute at the time, Mr. Lyndon LaRouche, who's an American economist and actually a political leader, he also run for president several times in the United States. His wife, Helga LaRouche, had founded the Schiller Institute as an international think tank, research center. And it was this which attracted me to the ideas that this is something completely unique, it's different. And also I was interested in knowing what happened to my country, because we have been through wars for many times. And I needed to know more about both what really happened in history and also how to present solutions to these problems, not only analyze things. And LaRouche had founded a weekly magazine called Executive Intelligence Review already in 1971, which I started working in 1995, 96. I moved to Germany for a while, to the main office of the Schiller Institute, and also this publication, Executive Intelligence Review. I can share with you some interesting images. Sorry. This is the cover of the magazine. Here I am with Mr. Lyndon LaRouche in 2004 after the invasion of Iraq by the United States, which was based on lies. But he, as a presidential candidate, presented a solution for the Iraqi situation. We presented that in an interview I did with him in Germany. And he used that in his election campaign. And he said, don't change the Iraqi constitution. And because de facto the United States had already invaded Iraq. And he said, don't change the constitution, don't demolish the military, don't demolish the police and security because you will have chaos. And this is exactly what the United States and Britain did in Iraq, which gave us all this chaos all these years. And Iraq today, we don't even have enough electricity or water for the people. So this is the cover of the magazine EIR, but to the other side, this is the first ever known map of what is people call the New Silk Road today. This is from 1992, July 17, from the weekly issue. And it says Eurasian Lake Project paves road to peace. And this was the idea which LaRouche had developed after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Actually, even before the fall of the Berlin Wall, LaRouche said we should have some sort of a development concept for Eastern Germany to unite the two Germanys, but also to expand infrastructure and industrial projects into Eastern Europe and Russia, and eventually with China, and to unite the whole Eurasian continent and then expand into Africa by building these kinds of infrastructure projects. So I worked with Mr. and Mrs. LaRouche and a team to produce, this is the first ever, comprehensive study of what we call the Eurasian Land Bridge, or the New Silk Road. This came after a conference in Beijing in 1996, which the Chinese government under Jiang Zemin hosted. And Mrs. LaRouche was actually invited to the conference in 1996. So as soon as she came back, we compiled this report, which is in 270 pages. It's not like a simple book, it's a study, but it's a book length study, sorry. And then this is the first map. Of course, we did not come up with this ourselves, only that this was our concept, but then in consultation with engineers, with governments, with planning ministries from many, many different countries, where we have actually a vast network of both correspondence and intelligence collection activities. So we managed to put together this picture and then expanded it to the Americas. And so this is the way to peace. This is the way to avoid all these wars and end geopolitics, because geopolitics has been the source of 2 world wars and is continuing today and is threatening us with a 3rd world war. So these are the things we worked on after President Xi Jinping presented the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. We once again updated our report. We called it The New Silk Road Becomes the World Land Bridge, and it was translated into Chinese immediately, but I translated it to Arabic. This is a 400-page study. It covers every part of the planet, how to connect the infrastructure and industrial and agriculture of these nations. Then, of course, I work on Southwest Asia or West Asia. The Middle East is a wrong term. It's a British colonial term. There's no place called Middle East. This is a concoction. Anyway, West Asia, Southwest Asia, and also my colleagues from different parts of the world, we developed further this concept to connect every region of the world internally to, and also create national development plans. I did a plan for the reconstruction of Syria with a colleague, and also a reconstruction plan for Yemen right now. So I also, with my colleagues, we co-authored this report, which we call Extending the New Silk Road to West Asia and Africa, because we saw the fantastic work that China immediately started doing in Africa. And so we wanted, because the LaRouche movement had plans for Africa since the 1970s, but they were never implemented because there was no intention in Europe or the United States to develop Africa. The same thing for the New Silk Road. Actually, what Lyndon LaRouche and the Schiller Institute said, we proposed this to the Western European countries. that in the triangle between Vienna, Berlin, and Paris, you have the world's greatest concentration of industrial technology. That was in the 1990s. That this should be the kernel to expand industrial development all over Eurasia and in Africa. But these countries were not interested. The United States was not interested. As I said, from my own life, 1991, we had the war on Iraq, and then we had a completely unipolar world order which prevented economic and development. But China took the initiative and developed it and started working with Russia, with the other Asian countries and in Africa. And that's why we wanted to present this new vision of Africa so the Europeans and Americans could be inspired. Now we have the concept of not only the Eurasian language, what we call the world language. You can actually connect all the continents with infrastructure. Australia is different, you can connect it with maritime, but you can actually connect North America with Eurasia through the Bering Strait. It's a mere 100 kilometers, and both the Chinese, the Japanese have shown interest in connecting it with infrastructure. But our view of the whole situation and all our analysis, all our even intelligence and forecasting, Mr. Lyndon LaRouche is an expert on economic forecasting. He made very important forecasts, the most important of which was the forecast in 1971 when he said that the Bretton Woods system is coming to an end now. And it actually happened on the 15th of August, 1971. And we are going to have an international conference on the 14th of August, next Saturday, or 2 Saturdays, on this question. And this propelled LaRouche into a world-known, because he was the only one who said this is going to happen. Another forecast he did was in 2007. He said the whole financial system is coming down, and there should be a reorganization. And exactly in 2008, in August, September, the global financial crisis erupted. He also, we don't have time to go through that. He also anticipated the 9/11, 2001 attacks. He said there will be a new Reichstag fire, like in Germany, to give dictatorial powers to the Bush administration to run the United States and the world on emergency law basis, crisis management. But we can discuss this another time. Anyway, the idea comes from LaRouche's economics, what he calls physical economics, which deals with the physical development through human creativity and how technological advancement can increase the productivity of a society, but also what he calls the relative potential population density. How to increase the population density through scientific technological progress, but building what we call or LaRouche called the development corridors. So all these lines we have on our maps, these are not trade routes. Trade is a secondary thing, actually. What we do here is you bring, especially in landlocked areas, you build the transport, which is railways, highways, canals, river transport, and around it you build industrial and agricultural and urban centers. It should be powered generally by nuclear power, but you can also build gas and oil pipelines. So you can raise the potential of the people and the land of these regions through introducing new technologies into these regions. This is the concept. This is the main idea behind behind what we discuss as the new Silk Road or the Eurasian or the world language.
Well, this is very interesting. I like your phrase when you put the phrase saying when you want to get rich, start building a road. And actually, we've seen this in China. Actually, I've been in China for 25 years, and I saw it every time. It's they put the infrastructure first, and then the rest comes after.
Exactly.
I have a question about there's a lot of talk about Afghanistan, and there's with the partial withdrawal of US troops, what are the changes that could happen there? And what are the infrastructure projects related to the Belt and Road Initiative in Afghanistan?
Yeah, well, I think in the recent period, we have had several conferences. By the way, I also a board member, a founding board member of the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden. I have been living in Sweden, I forgot to mention that, since 1996. I'm an Iraqi-Swedish citizen. So here in Sweden, to encounter all the lies and the disinformation about the Belt and Road, which I should actually just briefly discuss why the Belt and Road Initiative is so important. Because what it represents is not only all these things we have been proposing all these years, but what it represents is both a new way of looking at economic cooperation, at looking at trade, at relations among nations. It's a new method of governance. Now, the Chinese, they don't want to reinvent the world system, but they say this unilateral world, global system, which we have had since 1991, which, as I explained, it just gave us all these wars and terrible things, should be replaced by a new governance system based on the United Nations Charter. China is not is inventing a new system. They say we have to go back to the United Nations Charter, and they have Russia, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization with them, and Africa. That nations are equal, they are sovereign and independent, and nobody should interfere in their internal matters, except when it comes to economic cooperation. Nations can offer each other economic cooperation, what the Chinese call win-win. Now, this is not a gimmick, this is not a trick. It is both a philosophy, but as we can prove, it's a scientifically proven principle. And the Belt and Road Initiative is the proof of this new way of looking at economics. If you make your neighbor richer, wealthier, you will benefit yourself. And therefore, the technologies that developed in any part of the world should benefit everybody. That's China's principle. But what China in 2008, they learned a very terrible lesson, because China was very dependent on exporting mostly consumer goods, cheap products to the rest of the world. It was the world factory, in a sense. It is still the world factory, but it's an advanced world factory. But with the 2008 crisis, China, because world trade almost stopped. I mean, we had one of the worst economic depressions in Europe and the United States, and which was reflected around the world. So China had to rethink certain of its policies and focus on the internal development of China, but also, ironically, the first high-speed railway was inaugurated in August 2008, before the Olympics in Beijing. It was the same month the financial markets crashed in Europe and the United States. But that was the first step. And then China since then have built 30,000 high-speed railway track, built the world's largest dams. So this way, China became the world champion in construction. It developed its technologies, it developed its financial ability to finance infrastructure. And therefore, this was like the tool China could use by developing other nations in the world and not be dependent only on exporting to the United States and Europe. And therefore, you have to develop your neighborhood in East Asia, South Asia, Central Asia, Africa, South America. So you create new markets where the living conditions of the people can increase, their purchasing power increases, and therefore it becomes a good market for China, but it's also good for those people themselves. China also is opening up for those nations to export to China. So there is a fair trade between the two parts. So the necessity created by the financial crisis, but also this discovery that you can actually develop from a poor nation into an advanced industrial nation is not such an impossible thing. It's possible in Africa, it's possible in Asia, everywhere. This will benefit those nations, it will benefit China. And therefore, China pushed very hard this initiative. And now we have 140 nations out of 190 nations. I mean, people think China is isolated. Those are people who are just sitting here in Sweden or Denmark or the United States watching Swedish or Danish or American TV. But the ones who are isolated now are Europe and the United States. You cannot isolate China anymore, and you cannot stop the Belt and Road Initiative. This is one important point to make.
So it's going to help the neighbors, especially the landlocked area in Central Asia, like Afghanistan. Yes. Afghanistan would be, if there was no Belt and Road Initiative, it would be very isolated from the world because it doesn't have access to the sea. Exactly. Any updates when it comes to Central Asia? What are the projects there?
Okay, if we look a bit at Afghanistan itself, because Afghanistan now could become a new center of destabilization and problems for all Eurasia, or it could become the place where a new order develops. So it's like the Chinese say, this is a crisis, but within the crisis, there is a potential for a huge solution. So you can have both these two things in your mind when you look at Afghanistan. And right now, China, Russia, the Central Asian nations, Iran, Pakistan, and even India, all of them are members or observers in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And now there's intensive diplomacy to make sure that the different parties in Afghanistan come to the conclusion that no one of them can control the country totally, and it's better for them to have a reconciliation process. But what China, Russia, and the neighbors of Afghanistan can do, and even Europe or the United States, if they wish, what they can do is help the Afghanis rebuild their country, and that paves the way to stability. I mean, China solved the problem of terrorism in Xinjiang, not by bombing weddings and funerals like NATO is doing, but by developing Xinjiang and giving a better living standard. Of course, you have to deal with the extremists, with the terrorists, that's necessary. But the long-term solution is economic development. So Afghanistan is, I can share my screen again. Afghanistan is a very peculiar place. It's a very rough terrain. It's part of the Hindu Kush Mountains, an extension of it, and the Himalayas. And it's a very tough terrain, and it's a very dry country. When the British came, in the 18th century and 19th century, what they wanted to do is they wanted to prevent Russia, which has ambitions to expand southward, to stop Russia from expanding. And therefore, they tried to take over Afghanistan, but they failed 2 times. They lost 2 major wars in the 1840s and 1870s. But what they managed to do is to make deals with tribal leaders to make the Afghanistan a buffer zone, a barrier, both natural but also political barrier, to stop Russia from expanding to the Indian, the British Indian colony. And Afghanistan continued to be a place where the British, in 1919, 1920, there was a new British-Afghani war, which the British lost again. So the destabilization of Afghanistan became important, especially after the Soviet Union was there. And it became also, as we all know, this whole Afghan-Soviet war, where the United States and Britain jointly with their allies financed and trained and armed what we call the Mujahideen. But out of that came all these other terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda, and so on and so forth. So, but Afghanistan continued to until today a source of destabilization, not only for Russia, but also for China and all the neighbors of Afghanistan. Iran is hit by terrorists, but also you have the drug problem. Afghanistan under the Taliban almost eliminated the production of opium in cooperation with United Nations and one gentleman who was the head of the United Nations, crime and drugs fighting organ. He's an Italian, Mr. Arlacchi. He was a guest in our conference last week. But when the United States and Britain went into Afghanistan after 9/11 in 2001, the production of opium exploded in Afghanistan, especially in the Helmand River Plateau region. And Afghanistan produces and still does 80% of the opium in the world. We have drug addiction problems in all the countries around Afghanistan, but we also have around 18,000 Russians die of overdose of heroin every year. So this is worse than a war. This is a real opium war. So anyway, the neighbors of Afghanistan are interested in stabilizing Afghanistan. And what is new in this situation is that not only the Taliban are a bit different now, because as we have seen, they were open to discuss with Iran, which they considered as an enemy. Iran hosted a meeting of the Taliban and government representatives, although there's old blood between the Taliban and the Iranians, because the Taliban, when they took over Afghanistan in 1997, 98, they went to the Iranian embassy in the north, in the consulate, and they killed the Iranian diplomats. So, but the Iranians were willing to forgive. We also had the meeting between the Chinese foreign minister, Wang Yi, and the representative of the Taliban. And Russia also hosted meetings of the Taliban and government representatives. India is interested. So there is a major mobilization to make sure that Afghanistan doesn't explode into a new civil war, and also that there are no terrorist activities like we had in the 1990s, which affected China, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Iran, and even Pakistan. So the failed policy of NATO by going there and bombing the place the whole time without building any real infrastructure or economic development is obvious for everyone. So there's a new policy, a new constellation emerging now within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. This map shows all the members and observers of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which includes rivals like Pakistan and India, for example. But now they can work together there. We have Iran is an observer, but it's an important element in stabilizing Afghanistan. It also has influence in Afghanistan. So, but all these nations, except for India, have, Turkmenistan, they entered the Belt and Road Initiative, and they have massive strategic and economic cooperation plans with China. So Afghanistan is squeezed between two of the 6 main Belt and Road corridors. The first one, and which is the most important one, is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor in letter B to the south of Afghanistan. And we have the so-called New Silk Road from China, which goes from Xinjiang, Central Asia, Iran, and Turkey. This is also one of the major Belt and Road, but Afghanistan has not been able to participate in the Belt and Road or any projects because the US and NATO existence control there. I mean, Afghanistani government, they joined the Belt and Road in 2016. The Afghani government joined the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in 2017, but they were not able to do any meaningful work. So from our standpoint, this is from our old report on the Eurasian land bridge, which we proposed also this building a network of infrastructure corridors, development corridors from throughout Central Asia, but connecting to China, Russia, Pakistan, India, and also Iran. I'm not going to go through all of this, but it included a section which was developed by a Russian think tank for building development corridors within Afghanistan and using Afghanistan instead of a barrier, a buffer zone, into a bridge between Central Asia, North Eurasia, and South Asia. Now in Afghanistan itself, they are trying to develop some of these ideas. This is from the Afghani Foreign Ministry itself. They say we have all these development around us on the Belt and Road, but it does not really reach into Afghanistan. And therefore now the idea is to build corridors which will join these different Belt and Road corridors to integrate Afghanistan into the larger Belt and Road. And there are many ideas like the building from Pakistan and Peshawar, the Khyber Pass to Kabul, and to Dushanbe in Tajikistan. We have also the plan to build a corridor from Pakistan to Kabul and to Uzbekistan into Turkmenistan, from Iran into Western. We have already a railway going to Herat. We have actually a train which went from China into Central Asia and to Hayratan in northern Turkey, in northern Afghanistan. But inside Afghanistan, we don't have railways and highways connecting these different parts of Afghanistan and to connect the north and the south, east and west. So now there's a chance, there's a possibility to do that. And even the Taliban representative have told the Chinese foreign minister that we hope that China can come and contribute to the reconstruction of Afghanistan. So there is hope that this will, because as I mentioned in the beginning, the Israeli-Palestinian peace process failed because there was no focus on economic development. Now this could be put on the table in the negotiations for to give incentives to the different Afghani parties and the people that economic development should be the basis for peace. Now, what is different now, which makes me hopeful than in the 1990s and since 2001, is the world has changed. And it has changed mostly due to China's role in the world. And also China's cooperation with Russia. Now, there have been many games before to split Russia and China. This is not happening anymore. There's a strategic cooperation relationship between the two sides. The Central Asia, as I mentioned, Pakistan is a strong ally of China on the Belt and Road through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And Pakistan have actually refused to host American bases from which they can attack Afghanistan and continue this horrible nightmare. I mean, you asked me if the United States is going to withdraw totally or not. I mean, they are hoping to keep a foot there where they can continue this, what they call war on terrorism, which had failed. Uzbekistan has also refused to give bases to the United States. Iran, of course, is not willing to cooperate with the United States on these matters. So we have Pakistan is now in a different position than it was in 2001. It had to help the United States and Britain in the war on terrorism, which had terrible impact on Pakistan. Now, Pakistan, they say, we don't want to be part of this. Iran has just signed a 25-year strategic and economic agreement with China. And now we have the Central Asian nations. In the 1990s, I mean, if you remember what happened to Russia, Russia went from a communist country into a complete flea market, I call it, not free market. Russia and its assets were sold in the flea market. And the people of Russia, I mean, the industries of Russia were destroyed. The oil and gas of Russia and other was stolen by the oligarchs. And people were literally starving in Russia in 1996, 97. We knew people in Russia, professors, people in the, in the Russian Academy of Sciences. They didn't have food on the table. But then with Putin coming into the picture, stabilize the situation, reverse this policy, and now Russia is in a different position. The Central Asian nations got the same treatment in the 1990s because, oh, we are finally free from the Soviets and the Russians. Western, both politicians, but also oil and gas companies went into Central Asia and said, we will help you get out your wealth to the international markets. And everybody will be rich. But you should work with us, not with Russia, not with China. Now, already in the 1990s, I told my friends, this is not going to happen because economically it's impossible. And it's not feasible in an economic sense to isolate Central Asia and say they will work with Europe and the United States. It doesn't work. Your geo-economic reality, you cannot change that. It could be a curse that you are landlocked, but it could be an advantage if you work with your neighbors. So now nobody helped those nations. What happened is that they encouraged those nations not to work with Russia, not to work with China. And then they had introduced into those countries what I call the human rights mafia, Human Rights Watch, the International Republican Institute in the United States, the National Endowment for Democracy, George Soros Open Society, and they started paying NGOs and civil society groups to go against their own governments. In 2005, Uzbekistan, there was a bloody riots which were used by a terrorist group called the Uzbekistan Islamic Movement, which is a sister of the Uyghur East Turkestan Islamic Movement. They work together, and they turned these riots, or so-called democracy revolt against the Uzbek government, into really bloody massacres. And in that point, in 2005, the Uzbek government told both the George Soros Society to pack and leave, Human Rights Watch, all the NGOs were kicked out, and they had to re-register once again. And the Soros organization is today are not allowed. Human Rights Watch, they had to fight a lot to get back. But those countries realized that working with the West will only bring trouble, and the promised wealth never came. So I will show you a couple of.
I'm glad you're jumping into this, because my next question is actually related to what I call the encirclement of China, which started a long time ago. It started during the Vietnam War and the Pentagon Papers, and I wanted to also to approach everything which is related to what the US and the West is doing just to put obstacles in the Belt and Road Initiative and the reasons. Could you go more into like details and maybe some examples on how it is putting a bit chaos in the region? We saw it in Myanmar. We have Aung San Suu Kyi. She did everything to stop Belt and Road Initiative project. We have Balochistan. The US is financing Balochistan separatist movement in Pakistan. We have in Myanmar. We have many examples. Xinjiang is another example. Could you give us your thought about this?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the Balochistan problem. Is that this is a typical geopolitical game. I mean, the British started this actually, but the United States has taken over the question of the Baluchi people independence. And there were many moves in the 1990s, but also in the 2000s, to get separatist movements active in Balochistan, because what that would do is both it will spoil China's cooperation with Pakistan, because it will cut most of the Arabian Sea from Pakistan-China cooperation. It will also be a buffer between Pakistan and Iran. And also it will take a huge chunk of Afghanistan and eastern Iran, where you also have a Baluch population. So this is a typical geopolitical game. We have the Kurds, for example. I lived with the Kurds. I grew up with the Kurds. I have a lot of respect and love for the Kurdish people, but their political leaders always go along these geopolitical games. They choose an ethnic group which lies on the border between 3-4 nations. Like the Kurds are on the border between Turkey, Iran, Syria, and Iraq. And then they try to play this group by giving them promises, financing them, training them, arming them, and playing one country against the other, because Turkey is a member of NATO. But you have Syria was supporting the Kurds fighting Turkey, but suppressing its own Kurds. You have Iraq helping the Kurds in Iran as a geopolitical tool, but suppressing its own Kurds. Iran was helping the Kurds in Iraq. And so all the powers use different Kurdish factions, but the international powers are using the whole situation to split those nations. So that's what is dangerous.
Yeah, Hussein, just is it this those problems related to colonial times, how they were carving up countries on purpose so they could divide? We see Kurdistan being separated being part of in 3 different countries. We saw Kuwait. Just for example, Kuwait naturally maybe what was more you probably know better than me, but was more supposed to be part of Iraq. Do you think all those carving up on the colonial times were done on purpose to plant the seeds for divisions?
Yes, of course. I mean, it's yes and no, because I mean, in certain areas, yes, we do have the colonial powers drawing the borders and placing, say, one ethnic group on both sides of the border. But what we had later after World War II is that the status quo was accepted for the sake of stability and peace. So the nations, like in Africa, all the African borders were drawn by the colonialists. But African nations said, look, if we start picking on these issues, we will divide each African countries into smaller and smaller entities. And these entities will be fighting each other, not living in peace with each other. So the modern nation states, which came out of this colonial system, they should be respected, although with the different ethnic mixture inside them. I mean, look at Afghanistan. You have Tajiks, you have Baluch, you have Pashtuns, you have Uzbeks, you have Turkmens, you have Persians. But Afghanistan is a modern nation state. It has its borders. Everybody respects that, but also respect the diversity within the nation. But the identity of the nation is that it should be Afghanis. I mean, in 2011, I became unpopular because I was against the referendum for independence in Southern Sudan. Because the British and the United States went into Sudan and said, look, you've had this civil war all these years, but then there was peace. There was oil flowing from Southern Sudan into Northern Sudan. Even Chinese companies were working there and everybody was happy. The British and Americans went in there and said, no, you should become independent. So they forced the Sudanese to accept the referendum. I said, look, this is not gonna work. Southern Sudan will not be a sovereign nation, because it's made of two major tribes, two guerrilla groups, the Dingas and the Nuers. And I say, as soon as, because you cannot create an artificial state this way. And I said to people that if after independence, you will have these two groups fighting each other for power, because there are no borders between these two tribes. There are dispute areas. And this is exactly what happened. As soon as Southern Sudan became independent, you had a new civil war between the two major Southern Sudanese tribes who have their own militias. So if you go into Africa and start redrawing the borders, saying, oh, these were colonial borders, they should be abolished, you will create more chaos. So you should accept the status quo and make sure that the different ethnic groups between different countries, they can prosper through economic development. If they prosper through economic development, then this kind of game will end. And people can travel freely, but they have to respect the sovereignty of those nations, that each nation is sovereign. So we have to respect the principle of sovereignty and not go back and redraw the maps once again, saying these are colonial maps. These are now modern nation states with diverse, it's not a problem to have diverse ethnic and religious groups within one nation. They can coexist if they have a constitution, if they have law, then there's no problem. But the main thing is economic development. That brings prosperity to those nations. So anyway, in Central Asia, it's more sensitive. I mean, we have had many games. I can show you one of the games being played.
So why, Hussein, why the US is fighting so hard in terms of communication, in terms of funding NGOs, which are, they're all fighting the Belt and Road initiatives. Sometimes it's human rights, sometimes it's ecology. Why is it a danger for the US?
Well, the United States is currently following this geopolitical idea of zero-sum game. And on the one hand, you have the economic issues that you should undermine your rivals. China is a big rival. We should undermine China's economic development. And one way of doing that is to encircle China with either enemies or unstable areas. Now, this goes back to the British old plan, which is called the Arc of Crisis, which the United States also adopted. You know, Bernard Lewis, who's a British ideologue and geopolitician. He died recently, but he worked in the United States. And Zbigniew Brzezinski was one of his disciples. As national security advisor, they came up with this idea, what they called the arc of crisis, is that to create an unstable area south of the Soviet Union using the Islamic card. All the Islamic populations south of the border with the Soviet could be used as a way of destabilizing the Soviet Union and undermining it. They're using the same thing against China. Another issue of geopolitics is that, like, that's why we had World War I, for example, is that for the British, it was key that Germany especially and Russia, they should never work together. They should always be separated. This is one of the key principles of British geopolitics. They should never work together. Now, another thing which the British didn't like is that Russia, China, and the United States should never become friends or allies. And there are people who don't really understand the history of the United States so well. They think the United States is an imperial power since many years, centuries. That's not true. We had different American, the United States was an ally when the United States was fighting the British. Russia was the ally of the American revolutionaries. In the Civil War, the Russia and other nations, they created an alliance to support, or at least not to undermine, the northern states. So there is a different history, but this is another story. But for geopoliticians, they believe in this zero-sum game, that nations are enemies of each other, that the world is a jungle. This is Thomas Hobbes, that individuals and nations, we are like animals, the winner takes it all. If you're not powerful, you'll be eaten up by more powerful people. This is a silly ideology. Unfortunately, many people buy it, and many powerful people in the world today buy it. So they see the rise of China as a threat. Why is the rise of China a threat? It's because of the zero-sum game thing, because they think there are limited resources, and if China takes more resources, we will have less. That's not true. In our economic view, scientific and technological progress can create more resources. As President Xi Jinping says, we shouldn't fight over a small cake. Let's make the cake bigger.
Absolutely.
And scientific and technological progress makes the cake bigger, so we don't need to fight over this small thing. And this is a different philosophy. These are the two philosophies that we have had in fighting for thousands of years. It's not a new thing. One is a humanist, Republican, we call it. The other one is oligarchical imperialist. And now the time has come where I think the oligarchical system is falling internally. It's like the Roman Empire. It's self-destructing economically, socially, and so on. So these are the things, but now the things have changed. As I said, Central Asia, for example, when they didn't get help to get their oil and gas out, they started working with China. Now, one of the big economic projects is the Central Asia-China gas pipeline. This started already in 2007 with one line. Now it's 3 pipelines, and the 4th is being built through Kyrgyzstan to transport Turkmen gas to China and to the Chinese natural gas network. It goes to Horgos in Xinjiang. And this is a massive infrastructure project, but it's a very important way to get Turkmenistan and these nations value for their wealth. And Turkmenistan, although it's not a member of the Belt and Road Initiative because it has a neutrality principle adopted, they are working very heavily with China. All these neighbors of China, now this gas pipeline, for example, it started with 10 billion cubic meters per year. Now it transports 40 billion cubic meters of natural gas to China per year, and it will develop even more. Just to give a comparison, the Nord Stream from Russia to Germany, which there's so much fight about, carries 50 billion cubic meters, almost the same as this. So this is a huge advantage for the Central Asian countries. They discovered that their geo-economic reality is more important And therefore, they are working now more with China, even with Russia. Kazakhstan is building an oil pipeline to China. This can open the way even to Korea and Japan. There's no conflict. There are also possibilities to transport the gas through Afghanistan to India, Pakistan, and India. But that was a geopolitical project the United States and NATO adopted to make sure that Turkmenistan doesn't work with China and they wait for help from NATO to sell their gas to India. That never materialized because of the failed policy in Afghanistan. So now all these nations in Central Asia are open to work both with Russia and with China. So the whole policy to split those nations away from Russia and China failed. And the geoeconomic reality now has the primary seat. And many of these nations have adapted their national development plans to the Belt and Road. And China is building lots of infrastructure projects and even industrial zones. I mean, Kazakhstan has become the main corridor between China and Europe for rail transport. So this has big effects on these nations. And now they realize that their future lies not in the West, it lies within their environment, their geographical reality. And therefore they are being attacked now as authoritarian regimes in the West. Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, they are all being attacked by the same human rights mafia. But now they are kicked out of the area and they cannot have much influence. So that's a new reality which people have to think about. I think I had one more. There is this game which was played before, now it's almost dead. The idea of this pan-Turkic empire, which was pushed by Turkey a lot as a member of NATO, that all these nations from Turkey into the Caucasus, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, parts of Iran, parts of Syria, parts of Iraq, Kazakhstan, all the, Kyrgyzstan, even Xinjiang, and all whole parts of Russia, and also the Crimea, the Krim, Yes, they say this is all Turkish speaking, and parts of Chechnya and the, Anyway, this was pushed a lot for many, many years and financed and armed. And you have all these terrorist groups. They had actually many of them, including the ones fighting in Syria, the Uyghurs and Chechens fighting in Syria. They all were backed by Turkey as a NATO member. But now they are realizing that this game is ending. It's not going to work. And this kind of insane geopolitical games have to stop because Turkey itself is threatened.
Yeah, they have internal problems, right? There was a coup that was orchestrated by the US.
Yes.
And you have lots of, and it's all managed out from Washington. So they have to deal with their own problems first before.
They also have economic and financial problems.
Absolutely,
which are not always on the radar screen. But Turkey has very deep economic and financial problems because for many, many years Turkey was. It's called dollar carry trade and yen carry trade because the interest rates were so low in the United States, Europe, and Japan. Financial institutions could borrow for 0 interest rate and lend to Turkey for 9% interest rate, and Indonesia and all these other so-called, and Brazil. And this way they created huge bubbles. I mean, the Turks, they spent a lot of that money. Now they have a huge debt, their currency is threatened. But at the same time, Turkey did build a lot of infrastructure, agricultural projects, industrial projects. They're working with China, they're working with Russia. They have the Blue Stream gas pipeline from Turkey going to Turkey. So the Turks are very pragmatic. And therefore, Europe and the United States are not happy with the Turks because they would always tend to look after their own interest rather than their affiliations.
Hussein, that brings me to the US dollar hegemony question. So China is somehow recycling its US dollar trade surplus in the Belt and Road Initiative. So adding to this, there are many trades and transactions that are not dealt in US dollar. We saw it in the deal, the 25 years deal with Iran. We see that now between Russia and China, the trades are being done under swap system, either ruble or renminbi. So do you think this could be seen as an attack on the dollar hegemony?
Yeah, I think the right term is to say it's a defense against the dollar hegemony. Because first of all, the United States has used the fact that almost all transactions in the world are done in US dollar, international transactions. And if you use dollar in your business, you come directly under US jurisprudence, legislation. So therefore, you can be persecuted by US by U.S. Finance Ministry or Justice Department for something you've done in another country, you have done in Africa. But the United States still has, American law has become international law. So they can persecute you. They can use the power of the US economy, the power of its financial institutions to get you anywhere on the planet. And this has been disruptive, of course. And the US sanctions imposed on all nations, like Russia, China, Iran. Before that, we had Iraq. I mean, anybody they don't like, they impose sanctions on. And therefore, China, Russia, Iran, all these countries have to find an alternative, a defense mechanism against this hegemony. And therefore, the right thing to do is to have alternative currency arrangements. Like you mentioned, the Chinese, now the Chinese are trying to use the digital renminbi or yuan even for the international transactions. And it will be used mostly in the Belt and Road countries, which are now 140 countries. So they want to avoid this US control over what China does, and arresting people, putting them in prisons, because they have used the dollar. So this is a way of doing it, but also, as you said, China has an enormous surplus, which one has to recycle. As I said before, in the LaRouche physical economics, money has no real value. It's just a political tool. So if you don't use that money to create physical wealth by investing in infrastructure, scientific development, education, agriculture, that money is worthless. I mean, the United States is printing trillions of dollars. Did that improve the living conditions of American people? Did that improve the American infrastructure or healthcare system? No, because that money is not used for that. It's used just to create bubbles and live off these financial revenues and bubbles. But there's a limit to what you can do with printing money. But China is doing the opposite. China did print money. I did a comparison in several presentations, because since 2008, the US Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of Japan, they produced almost $20 trillion in so-called quantitative easing. That money did not go to investment. It went to banks and financial companies to save them from collapsing. Now, the bubble is even much bigger than it was in 2008, and it could collapse any day now. This is something which not many people are discussing, but the whole international financial system is about to collapse. We don't know which day, but it's going to happen, because you have $3 quadrillions in this bubble, and it's unsustainable. China also created credit, $14 to $18 trillion since 2008, but all this $18 trillion went into high-speed rail, dams, industries, agriculture, eliminating poverty, both in China and outside China. So it's what you do with money, which is the issue, is not how much money you have, because money in itself does not have any intrinsic value.
Absolutely, I agree. So the last questions, so what are your views? It's a very difficult question. So what are your views on the transition, shift of power between the US and China? How do you see the 10, 20 years coming?
Yeah. Okay, I just need to connect my electricity. It's something I missed. My computer energy is going low. Just 1 second. That's one thing which we have to think about. You cannot have internet without electricity.
Absolutely. Well, this is the same problems they have in Africa. You know, in Africa, I mean, many places in Africa don't have electricity, and the West is trying to sell human rights and democracy while they don't have food, they don't have basic infrastructure and electricity. So it's those absurdities, and I like your approach, the movements, the LaRouche movement, which is all about tangible infrastructure, but tangible results too. You know,
right.
Are the people having a better life? Do they have access to education? I mean, and those are the real human rights, not the human rights that, having the right to complain, that's not a human rights. Human rights, it's something else, and we need to agree on the terms.
Right.
So what are your views on the transition, shift of power between China and the USA?
Yeah, I think due to the clash of these two philosophies in the world today, and also that the world is now, unfortunately, is divided. As I mentioned, we have China, Russia, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, many nations in Asia and Africa, even South America, are with China and this new governance order, which is not new. It's respecting the sovereignty of nations, stopping this hegemonic policy and zero-sum game, and stopping geopolitics. On the other side, the United States and the EU and Britain and their allies like Australia, Canada, they still think they can run the world, not realizing that they actually don't have the means to do that anymore. But that because we have a massive military machine both in the West and in the East. And this machine is becoming more and more sophisticated, but also becoming more and more unpredictable. So a small mistake in the Black Sea, where NATO is provoking Russia, or in the South China Sea, can lead to terrible consequences. So there is a huge danger that we could end up in a new global conflict. And one of the things people say is that the United States is abandoning Afghanistan because they want to focus on the South China Sea and on Russia, which is partially true because they cannot sustain. It's just draining their capabilities there. But they want to focus on encircling China and Russia, but that's not going to help. That's not going to work in reality. It could lead to a larger war. So I think China is winning the hearts and minds of people around the world, in spite of all the disinformation. And that system of governance, which is proposed there, and also the model of the Belt and Road Initiative, is becoming more and more popular. And I think eventually Europe and the United States have to accept either to join it or at least not try to obstruct it, because we have realities in Europe and the United States that have to be dealt with. I mean, you talk about electricity in Africa, we're gonna have brownouts and blackouts in Europe, in Germany, in Italy, recently in Milano, you had blackouts several times because people want to have more and more electric cars and electric bicycles and all kinds of things, but we don't produce electricity anymore. We don't build new electricity. The same thing in Germany. They are shutting down nuclear power. They are shutting down coal power. So they are committing economic suicide. Same thing in the United States. Recently in Texas, you saw what happened, a small blizzard and all the windmills and electricity disappeared. So there is an economic reality, social reality, which should force people in Europe and the United States to think again about the policy they have been following to try to undermine China and Russia, stop the Belt and Road. And I think somewhere there, we might get cooler heads in Europe and the United States to start to think about this and avoid a world war, God forbid, and start to realize that their own survival, their own economic and social well-being depends on working with China and Russia and nations who are in the Belt and Road. It's crucial. And many of our industries here in Sweden are dependent on China and other, Germany, Italy. I mean, not completely, but they are interconnected into the Chinese economy, into the whole, that system. So win-win is not a tactic, it's not a gimmick, it's a reality. And it will start imposing itself on people.
Thank you, Hussein. It was a great honor. I mean, really, I appreciate the work you're doing. I think this project is providing solutions for better world, and I really appreciate your wisdom, and really, it was a great honor to have you on my channel.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to be with you too.
Thank you.
Hope to see you again.
Soon.